The Allen Line Company thanks all the hard-working drivers who are moving goods across the country. We can't do it without you.
OOIDA, representing America's truckers since 1973, presents Landline Now with your host, Mark Redding.
Support is growing in our nation's capital for two bills that have a big implication for trucking. One that would stop a new speed limiter requirement, and another that would give truckers access to bathrooms at shippers and receivers. Scott Thompson has complete coverage. Shopping for insurance will never top the list of fun things to do, but it doesn't need to be quite so painful. We'll explain what you should know before you start seeking out quotes. Ashley Blackford talks with Trina Skywalker of OOIDA's Truck Insurance Department. Also on today's show, you may remember the case of a truck driver who flew to Arizona hoping to buy a truck at auction, only to have his $40,000 seized by law enforcement. Dan Albin of the Institute for Justice says you'd be surprised how often something like this happens. He joins us to talk about the case and offers some advice on what to do if you find yourself facing questions about the cash you're carrying. And now, here's Scott Thompson.
Thanks, Mark. We'll spend a little time in our nation's capital for the next several minutes, talking about growing support for two bills in particular that have implications within the trucking industry. The first and perhaps most pressing issue is the push within the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration to implement a speed limiter mandate on heavy trucks. You may recall last spring that a bill was introduced in the House that would essentially stop the rulemaking in its tracks by keeping the agency from implementing it. H.R. 3039, otherwise known as the DRIVE Act, now has 34 co-sponsors in the House. This after Representative Jeff Van Drew of New Jersey signed on in support this past week. The congressman gave us a hint about his upcoming support in December during a hearing in which he addressed then Administrator of FMCSA, Robin Hutchison, about his concerns.
These drivers give many examples of situations in which they need to accelerate for safety, whether it's merging into highway speed traffic, building momentum to go up a hill, or simply keeping up with the flow of traffic. It is a hard and difficult job, and they do it well. Your policy would take those options away from them. We're tired of this. We're tired of big government. You know, one gentleman, his comment was, not mine, his, quote, "This is a stupid idea," end quote. The policy is overreach. We're tired of overreach. It's a classic example of government coming to save us, against for ourselves. There's lots of independent truckers, and they would be harmed by this policy.
The DRIVE Act was introduced by Representative Josh Burkeen of Oklahoma just as FMCSA's speed limiter ambitions were taking shape. We spoke with him shortly after that.
Most Class A CDL drivers are conditioned to flow at the speed of traffic because they understand safety. And so I guess you'd have to be a truck driver to understand and to be sitting in that seat to understand the flow of traffic and how dangerous not going at the flow of traffic.
Pushback to the idea of a speed limiter mandate has been consistent and heavy from a variety of angles. Legislatively, the House bill is joined by a companion bill in the Senate, introduced by Senator Steve Daines of Montana, who told Landline that the truck driving community has more power than they may realize, and called on them to put some pressure on their elected representatives in Washington, D.C.
Well, I think it's really important that the folks at the grassroots level and our associations are working together to call their senators, call their members of Congress to push back on this radical agenda. And I think it's another reminder about elections having consequences.
Truck drivers have not been shy about expressing their opinions on a speed limiter mandate. An advance notice of supplemental proposed rulemaking last year yielded more than 15,000 comments, with the majority coming from truck drivers who are opposed to a mandate. And groups like the Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association have been vocal in their opposition as well, encouraging members to speak up and push back. To join that fight, check out fightingfortruckers.com. Meanwhile, back in the U.S. House, new details on that second bill we referenced earlier. Representative Jeff Van Drew featuring prominently here as well. The New Jersey congressman lending his support last week to H.R. 3869, otherwise known as the Trucker Bathroom Access Act. He signed on as a co-sponsor, along with Representative Brian Babin of Texas. H.R. 3869 is beautiful in its simplicity. It would simply require shippers and receivers to grant bathroom access to truckers who are dropping off or loading up at their facilities. Here's what Representative Troy Nehls of Texas told us about why he introduced this bill in the first place.
The idea, and I think, you know what, I think it's almost embarrassing. It is, as a member of Congress. I have to get in front of a committee and talk about, hey, we need to create a law to provide bathroom access to our truckers, with many of them women. Well, what the hell are you talking about? We got to get a bill to let somebody use a bathroom when they're delivering their goods and services? It makes no sense to me. It was actually embarrassing, quite honestly, to think that these truckers are going to have to go out there and find that fire hydrant or go out in somebody's yard or find a big tree. Hell, I don't know. But it's absolutely silly, and it's shameful that Congress has to intervene here and provide bathroom access for our truckers. What do you expect a woman to do? Now, come on, us boys, we can just go find that tree by the golf course, right? What does a woman do? You know, what are you doing? What are we doing? So we got to be better about this. So we filed it. That legislation, I think we're going to get that passed. I want to see somebody argue the point. I want to see a member of Congress say, I can't support that. Oh, that would be fun. I want 5 minutes with him.
The bill came out of the gates as a bipartisan piece of legislation. Representative Chrissy Houlihan of Pennsylvania, a Democrat, is an original co-sponsor. When we spoke with her after the bill was introduced, Representative Houlihan said this isn't just about common decency, but also about the greater supply chain.
It was brought to my attention when we were struggling, frankly, with recruiting truckers, and that this was one very simple and very pragmatic way that we could address that issue by trying to make sure that the quality of life and the working conditions were improved for our truckers.
Representative Houlihan also emphasized that H.R. 3869 would not require any funding or new facilities, or, in other words, it wouldn't cost taxpayers a dime, as it only requires restrooms that already exist be made available to truck drivers who are doing business with shippers and receivers.
So we're not asking people to spend any more money, businesses to do anything, as you mentioned, that would require an output of money or a burden on the business. And so it is sort of confounding. And sometimes I feel as though organizations sometimes are looking for, an opportunity to battle one another. This just feels like a no-brainer to me. And I'm really, really hopeful.
So to hammer a point from earlier home a bit more, making headway on these bills and others requires grassroots power, something OOIDA Executive Vice President Louis Pugh says truck drivers have in spades. And while getting involved may sound like a drag, Pugh said it's not as complicated or time-consuming as it may seem.
Yeah, the biggest thing I get, and I talk to members of truck shows and all the time here on The Office and all the time, and it's great. But the biggest pushback I always hear is, well, that's what you guys are for. I'm not good at talking to people. I don't know how to talk to a lawmaker. I don't know these bills. I don't understand. Blah, blah, blah. They love what we do, but they're like, I don't know. And I say, you're the expert. You're always the expert. So, and I remind people that there's lots of people on Capitol Hill telling lawmakers things that aren't true about trucking or that aren't going to make trucking better for you and for others out there. So that's why you need to educate them, and nobody better to educate them, because all these people who are telling them that this won't work, they never drove a truck.
The easiest first step starts at the fightingfortruckers.com website, where you can find an easy step-by-step guide to reaching out to your lawmakers and making sure your voice is heard. Reporting for Landline Now News, I'm Scott Thompson.
Thanks, Scott. Next, Ashley Blackford talks insurance with Trina Skywalker of OOIDA, and Scott Thompson covers civil asset forfeiture with Dan Albin of the Institute for Justice. I'm Mark Reddick, and this is Landline Now.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to like and subscribe. If you want more content, go to landline.media to get updated news, information, and archived editions of our show. Once again, that's landline.media.
Capital Reman, your leader in remanufactured diesel engines and components, is celebrating its 10th anniversary. Let us help you avoid costly downtime and repairs by visiting capitalreman.com today. Use code OOIDA10 to receive your member benefits.
Stock up on Howe's Diesel Treat, the nation's most trusted anti-gel. And to be safe from the harshest winter conditions, make sure you have Howe's Diesel Lifeline on hand, the fastest-acting gelling rescue product. Available nationwide, Howe's products are designed to keep you rolling through the toughest conditions. Visit houseproducts.com.
Attention professional drivers, are you behind on your tax filings? You owe money? Integrity Tax Relief Group frees drivers from IRS trouble. You watch the road, we'll keep an eye on the IRS. Call now, 855-976-4291.
Buckling up keeps everyone safe on the roads. Learn more at www.sharetheroadsafely.gov. Paid for by FMCSA.
Landline Now, welcome back. Like tires, fuel, and an engine, insurance is one of those things you just have to have for your truck. But not all insurance is created equal. Ashley Blackford is here with the experts from OOIDA's Truck Insurance Department to answer some questions.
Thanks, Mark, and hello to Trina Skywalker with OOIDA's Insurance Department. How are you doing today, Trina?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Good.
We're into the new year, and we're going to be talking about shopping today. Not about those, after Christmas sales, but shopping for insurance.
Oh, that's not as much fun.
Yeah. What are some of the things you should keep in mind before you start making calls for an insurance quote?
One thing I would recommend is keep in mind you're probably going to spend a lot of time on the phone. I mean, if you're calling multiple companies for quotes and asking questions, about what kind of quote you're getting, what kind of policy you're getting, it's going to take up a good chunk of your time. But I highly encourage it, highly recommend it, because it's the only way you're going to know more about what you're getting, what you're buying, what your money's going towards. One thing, and it's probably more important to others, or to some rather than others. I don't know that it's everyone's very top thing that they want to know, but one thing I've learned working here is that you do want to know where the profits are going. Ultimately, what is your money contributing to? Is this a company that ultimately dumps the funds into like anti-trucker legislation? Is it a company where the profits are dumped into something more trucker friendly? Mm-hmm. And that's hard to find out too. That's probably not something you're going to be able to call the agent and ask, depending on who you call.
Yeah.
We know all of our profits go back into the association, but, I don't know that most insurance agents are familiar with that part of the process. So that actually might be something you just have to go online and research. If you're, curious to know that, or if that's an important factor to you, that may require a little more digging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Why is it important to know what kind of coverage you need before making the calls, and how do you find out what you need if you're kind of new and just starting out?
First and foremost, it's going to depend on your operation. If you are getting your own authority, your own DOT number, you're going to be looking for primary liability and cargo. If you're leasing onto a company, they're generally going to cover that portion of it, but the lease agreement's going to ask you to carry usually a bobtail or non-trucking liability. Physical damage is going to be something you want to carry anytime you own your own truck, regardless of the nature of your operation. And really, a lot of times it comes down to the contracts. So if you have your own authority, FMCSA requires, or DOT requires, that you have the $750,000 primary liability. They don't require cargo. Your state might, but there's very few states anymore that require that. Otherwise, it's going to come down to contracts. So whether you're leased onto a motor carrier, it would be the lease agreement. If you are running under your own authority, it's going to be like the contract you have with your broker or shipper. And that's really what's going to tell you what they need you to have. So, the limits, the type of coverage. Outside of that, you're really just looking at extras, ancillaries, tack on kind of coverages. And that's what your agent's going to be able to ideally give you the most information about.
Now, I know this would depend on the company, but is it recommended to really know before you go into the call, or can you expect that the insurance company is going to know what you need?
There's a lot of folks that don't know, and that's okay. If you've owned your own truck for 20 years and you've always leased to a company and now you're getting your authority, you are going to be asking a lot of questions. You may not know right off the bat, even though you are an experienced driver, you're not necessarily, experienced with insurance and the difference in what you need now. Also, ideally, the agent that you're dealing with is able to answer those questions. I have had callers that have gotten frustrated calling around to other companies because sometimes the agent doesn't always know, or they're misguided, or they've purchased a coverage they don't need. I would hope that everyone is able to ask those questions. But I want to be honest, and I'm not trying to, slam any agents out there or anything like that, but it has happened. So I would recommend knowing as much as you can before you call, and then hopefully they can help, guide you the rest of the way. It's probably just going to depend on where you're calling. And the reason I say that, too, is because sometimes these calls come from someone who lives in a small town and their neighbor Joe owns an agency in town. But sometimes that agency is geared more towards like farm insurance or personal auto. And it's just that they don't have the experience with commercial auto. So, sometimes they'll try to support their local community or a local business and go through them for this type of coverage. Sometimes that works out. But if it's an agent or an agency that doesn't deal with that often, it can potentially cause problems because you're both kind of learning at that point.
Now, once you've received a quote, what other questions should you ask?
Well, there's the common questions that we've talked about a lot as far as knowing what's included in this quote that you've obtained. Are there extras included in the coverages, things of that nature? Also, though, I would dig a little deeper and try to find out when they do their underwriting. Do they do their underwriting all up front before you get the quote? Do they do their underwriting after you've made your down payment? Because we've seen that problem quite a bit where someone gets an attractive rate and they'll call us and say, sorry, such and such quoted me $100 less a month, blah, blah, blah. And then we'll get a call a little while later saying that the insurance company just did their underwriting. The rates went up significantly. And a lot of times it ends up being higher than some of your other quotes. And also, usually you've made a large down payment that you're not going to get back. So even if you say, hey, I can't afford that, I was given this quote, I want to cancel, a lot of times you're kind of stuck because you have made a large down payment and you're a lot of times not going to get it back. That's going to vary, too, because every state has a different underwriting period. Some states may only allow 30 days after you bind your policy to change the rate, if need be. Some states have 60 days, so that's something you could ask your agent. I think a lot of them should be familiar with that. You definitely want to find out what the likelihood is of your rate changing after you make your down payment. And hopefully they're honest and upfront with you about the possibility of that.
And is that the only thing you can do in hopes to prevent that kind of surprise?
No. But what I would say is to also be very upfront about everything. If you are withholding information, and I don't think a lot of people do it intentionally, but if you withhold information that the insurance company ends up finding out about later, that's the kind of stuff that's going to impact you. Maybe you had an incident on private property when you were released onto a motor carrier 2 years ago, and maybe someone even paid out of pocket for the damage. Maybe it was super minor and someone paid like $500 out of pocket. No insurance claim is filed. If you don't disclose that at the time of quote and then they come up on it later, it may not change your rate. That's, again, going to depend on the company that you're dealing with, but it could change your rate. So I would recommend that too, and we can't emphasize enough. Be transparent about any tickets you've had, moving or non-moving violations. Be transparent about any incidents, claims that you've had. We've had folks where we've had to do that. We found out about something after the fact and call them to say, you're going to experience a little bit of a premium increase. And they'll say, well, I didn't think that mattered because it was on private property or even a personal vehicle. And they don't think it's applicable to a commercial insurance policy. But it all is. So just be upfront about everything. I mean, that's really your best bet to avoid those kind of surprises.
What are some of the red flags that you should be looking out for?
That could vary. Again, everything depends on the insurance company that you're contacting or who you're getting a quote through. To me, a red flag is getting through a quote in 15 minutes and then getting a rate, again, depending on the coverage. But if you're getting your own authority and you're getting primary liability and cargo, there's a lot that goes into that. I mean, this insurance company is basically putting $1 million bet on you. We've discussed $750,000 is the minimum, but most carriers have $1 million. And they're going to dig into your history and they're going to ask about accidents. They're going to ask about tickets, experience. There's so much information to gather that if you answer a handful of questions and get a quote that quickly, to me, that's a red flag, just because as an agent, I know how much they have to delve into. And that's usually not a reasonable amount of time for them to gather the information they need to gather. Now, there's behind the scenes stuff they're going to do. You know, some of the checks that the underwriting or the insurance company does, the underwriting section, they're going to do that not on the call. You know, you're talking to the agent, the underwriters are the ones digging into it. So some of that is going to happen behind the scenes, but it still would sketch me out if I got a quote that fast. If you're just getting like physical damage and bobtail, there's not quite as much that goes into that. So you might get a faster quote with that. But sometimes it just makes me feel like they're just trying to get you a nice low rate to secure your policy because they know they've got wiggle room and time after that.
And do you get locked into that rate, or is that something to ask?
I would definitely ask because, I mean, you're locked into the initial rate that they give you, but if they decide to change it later, and I don't mean that to sound frivolous, like, oh, they just decided to change it.
Yeah.
But, you know, we've been discussing the various things that can make that happen. So I couldn't honestly say that you're locked into the initial rate that you get or the rate that is available when you make your down payment, because there is such not a likelihood, but there's a possibility it could change.
And are there reasons that people can cancel? Or I'm sure that varies with different companies, but
there are. I mean, usually you can request that your policy be canceled. And I don't think that they can just say no. But again, you're running the risk of losing that down payment. If you've got your own authority and there are filings with FMCSA or filings with your state, usually the insurance company has to give a 35-day notice. So it's not something you can just call today and be like, I want to cancel it, and they'll do that. Some companies will. A lot of them won't, though, because they're still basically on the hook for another 35 days. If the insurance company decides to cancel you, again, it goes back to that underwriting period, and that varies depending on what state you're out of. Maybe they run across the fact that you had a huge accident a couple of years ago and they don't want to continue with your insurance policy. They can also cancel it, but you can request that your policy be canceled anytime.
How is the down payment calculated?
Again, it depends on the company. A lot of them, I would say a good majority of insurance agencies finance the premium. And so, you know, that's something to look out for too. Maybe they'll say, hey, your rate's $10,000 a year. But once you add up your down payments and all those monthly payments, it's a little higher because of the financing. And so usually it's like 20% down is what I commonly see. So they'll take that annual rate and charge you like 20 or 25% down.
Okay. Any final thoughts, final questions that people should really keep in mind?
You know, one of the questions that you might ask up front, you know, kind of going back to that, is just to ask straight out if there is a penalty for cancellation. You know, since we've just discussed that, it would be good to know up front. Not to assume that you're going to need to do that, but it's still good to know if that's something that you could be encountering at that time. You know, again, I would add up all the payments. I would ask, too, going back to what I was saying, add up the down payment with all the monthly payments for the year, but also find out if they charge you extra to add an additional insured. A lot of brokers and shippers want to be additional insured, and if you've got 10 companies and the insurance company charges $25 a pop, it still could end up being a higher overall rate than company B, who does that for no charge. I would ask them how long it takes to get a certificate out. You know, some insurance companies might take 3 days to get proof of insurance to a broker, and you could potentially lose a load in that time.
Mm-hmm. All right. Trina, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our thanks to Trina Skywalker of OOIDA's Truck Insurance Department. If you have any questions about insurance, you can call 816-229-5791. For Landline Now, I'm Ashley Blackford. We'll have more after this.
Penske owns and operates some of the best-maintained vehicles on the planet. Our used trucks come with a 5-year maintenance report and pre-sale inspection. So if you're in the market for a top-quality pre-owned truck, look no further. Search our inventory today at PenskeUsedTrucks.com.
Control your toll costs and eliminate tolling headaches with Prepass Tolls. Prepass Tolls means toll volume discounts. Just one invoice for all tolls and fewer violations. Call 877-878-5970 or go to Prepass.com.
Ready to make more money? use a better load board. For a limited time, get 50% off Truckstop Load Board Pro. Just go to truckstop.com/go and enter promo code READY2023 when you purchase Load Board Pro.
It's tested and proven. Burn 2.1% less fuel when you balance all wheel ends with Centromatic. Call 800-523-8473 to get the OOIDA discount.
Welcome back to Landline Now. You may remember the story of Jerry Johnson, the owner of a small business trucking company who traveled to an auction looking to buy a truck only to have his $40,000 seized into civil asset forfeiture. We're going to look at that case through the lens of the greater problem with the help of our next guest. Dan Albin is senior attorney for the Institute for Justice, and he joins us on the line now. Dan, how you doing?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. First off, I think it's probably a good idea to let people know a little bit about your law firm, the Institute for Justice, and exactly what you do there. Can you explain that for us?
The Institute for Justice, or IJ, is a national public interest nonprofit law firm. We represent people in constitutional cases involving their constitutional rights when the government infringes on their right to private property, their right to economic liberty, their right to free speech, and their right to educational choice.
And that lines up perfectly with the case I mentioned there off the top with Jerry Johnson. This one dates back to August of 2020. Johnson was in Phoenix, Arizona to buy a truck with cash. Airport police stopped him. That led to the money being confiscated. Walk us through exactly what happened there and perhaps more importantly, and we'll get into this a bit more as we talk, but why the authorities thought they had the right to take his money, which they did.
Yeah, sure. So Jerry owns a small trucking company on the East Coast. He's based out of Raleigh, North Carolina. He has 2 trucks, and he was hoping to expand with a 3rd truck in the summer of 2020 at the sort of height of the COVID pandemic and the demand for trucking. And so he flew out to Arizona for a Ritchie Brothers auction in Phoenix, where he was hoping to get a used Peterbilt 579. And he took some money that he had borrowed from family, some money he had saved, and he had about $40,000 with him in cash, mixed between his carry-on bag and his check bag. And he flew with it to Phoenix in order to make a cash offer on a truck. And when he got to Phoenix, the Phoenix Police Department detectives approached him, began questioning him, told him there were things about his travel itinerary that seemed suspicious, and asked to search his possessions. So he allowed them to, and they found his money, and he said, "Yeah, this is my money." And he explained what it was for, but they didn't care. They said, "We think this is drug trafficking. You fit the profile of a drug courier. We think you're laundering money for," they didn't really say who, but presumably a drug cartel or something like that. And so they seized all of his money, but they didn't arrest him. They didn't charge him with anything. They actually asked him to sign a waiver releasing his interest in all of the property and suggested that he might not be free to go if he didn't sign this waiver. So he signed it to get out of there, and then went and contacted an attorney, and they moved to forfeit his property. And this is a relatively common occurrence. I know it sounds pretty crazy, but law enforcement all over the country does what they call airport interdiction, or sometimes highway interdiction, where they, based on various factors, identify people that they think are more likely than the average traveler to be engaged in some sort of illegal activity. And based on those factors, which can be something like buying a ticket at the last minute, buying a one-way ticket, paying for your ticket with cash, or if you're driving on the road, traveling between 2 known drug trafficking locations, or traveling on a known drug trafficking corridor, or having out-of-state plates, or driving a rental car, all sorts of things. They use that information to justify conducting a stop, which is sometimes described as a voluntary consent encounter, during which they try to obtain consent from someone to search their bags or their vehicle. And if they do that and they find cash, they generally seize it because they're operating under the sort of presumption that any large amount of cash must be connected to illegal activity. Now, of course, that's not true, and it's legal to travel with any amount of cash inside the United States. but law enforcement in many jurisdictions and at the federal level treats large amounts of cash as presumptively illegal and will seize it and try to forfeit it through civil forfeiture.
Which is entirely, legal from their point of view, right? I mean, there's nothing...
It's an entirely legal process. The constitutionality of it is still hotly debated, and there's a number of cases percolating up through the courts challenging various aspects of it. But civil forfeiture essentially allows law enforcement, without bringing criminal charges or securing a criminal conviction, to seize property and then permanently keep it because they suspect that it's connected to a crime. Now, in most states and at the federal level, if the case actually goes to court, the government has the burden of showing by a preponderance of the evidence, which just means more likely than not, or 51% likely, that the property is somehow connected to a crime. They don't even have to specify which crime or a specific crime. They just have to show that it's more likely than not connected to a crime. That's a pretty low burden.
Yeah.
And although technically the burden is on the government, it effectively puts the burden on the property owner to show their own innocence. Because when you have several law enforcement officers on the stand testifying that, in their 20-some years of experience as a law enforcement officer, they know how to identify drug couriers or money laundering or whatever it is, and this person fits 7 of the 11 characteristics that they look for, generally you've got to put something up to contest that. And so it ends up being a situation where someone is forced to prove their own innocence in order to get their money back. And in the vast majority of cases, people do not get their money back. In fact, in the vast majority of cases, it does not even go to court because the cost of litigating these cases can be quite high.
Yeah.
And typically the value of property that's seized is quite low. The national median from about 20 or so states that keep track of that data is about $1,000. So the average seizure is about $1,000 in cash, which means half of all seizures are less than $1,000 of cash. And in some states, like Pennsylvania and Michigan, it's way less than that. It's $300 or $400. So we're talking about pretty low amounts of money that are being seized. And we've estimated that at the low end, in a state court, to hire a forfeiture attorney, it would cost a minimum of about $3,500 to contest a basic state forfeiture case. And so for the vast majority of these people, it doesn't make sense from a dollars and cents perspective to actually challenge the forfeiture because they would spend more on the attorney than they would get back in the value of their property.
We should mention that Jerry Johnson did get his $40,000 back thanks to you and your colleagues there at the Institute for Justice. And I know there are some things being worked out there with attorney's fees and whatnot. But again, thanks to you and your colleagues, he does have that money back. Mm-hmm. You mentioned something earlier that I want to circle back to, and you mentioned that this is a lot more common than people may realize. You also mentioned that this can happen on highways throughout the United States, where, of course, a lot of our listeners do their work. Also, hearing you speak, it doesn't sound like there's a lot you can do if you do find yourself in this situation. But I'm wondering what advice you might have for people out there who do carry around, cash, obviously, because they're on the job and they're on the road and working. It could be a few $100, as you said there as well. Are there things that people can do or should do to protect themselves from a situation like this?
Sure. Well, let me start by just addressing sort of how common this is. This is big business for law enforcement. We looked at the data that's available for states and the federal government since 2000 through 2019, so a 20-year period. And over that period, almost $70 billion, billion with a B, was forfeited. That is a dramatic undercount because many states don't keep track of this data or didn't keep track of the data for the entire time period. In 1 year alone, in 2018, we were able to get data from 42 states, the District of Columbia, and the federal government, and we found that they forfeited over $3 billion in that year alone.
Wow.
So that gives you an idea of the scope of this problem and, how dependent many law enforcement agencies have become on this money for funding, because that's one of the things we didn't discuss yet. this money in general, in most states and at the federal level, goes back to law enforcement. They get to keep what they forfeit. It goes into special forfeiture funds that can only be spent by law enforcement agencies for law enforcement purposes. And of course, whatever they do is a law enforcement purpose.
Yeah.
So it essentially gives them free rein to spend the money on just about anything without having to seek approval from the city council, the state legislature, from Congress. They just get to spend the money on whatever they think is appropriate for law enforcement.
That's insane.
And so,
it just sounds insane. I mean, highway robbery is the term that comes to mind.
Yeah, I mean, that is certainly something we talk about when we talk about highway interdiction. That it certainly is a legalized form of highway robbery.
Yeah.
And it's not just it doesn't just create these perverse financial incentives, but I mean, it's also unconstitutional. Like the separation of powers is supposed to ensure that Congress or the legislature is the body that gets to decide how money is spent. And so Congress or the legislature has the power of the purse, not the executive branch. But here, the executive branch is wielding both the purse and the sword. And so you end up with these pretty awful situations where, everyone's appalled when they read about them because it sure looks like a completely innocent person got railroaded, had their stuff seized, and isn't going to get it back.
Yeah.
So that's the problem. Now, in terms of what you can do as an individual trying to not become a victim of forfeiture, there aren't a lot of great things that you can do, but I do have a handful of suggestions.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes people need to travel with cash for various reasons. Certainly, buying a used vehicle is a really common one. And, despite suggestions that maybe you could do it with a cashier's check or some other thing, if you get to the location where the vehicle is and you inspect it and realize this isn't up to snuff, it needs new tires, it needs engine work, whatever it is that needs to be done, you need to be able to, on the spot, lower the offer, or else you're going to be kind of stuck in town for however long it takes to make the deal. And so for most people, cash is really the only way to make it happen, especially for something that's, relatively high value like a used vehicle. So if you need to travel with a large amount of cash, there are a handful of things you can do. None of these are foolproof because there just isn't a way to guarantee that you won't be stopped and have your money seized. But we do have a handful of recommendations. First of all, it is important to know and don't be buffaloed by police who will tell you that you're traveling with some illegal amount of cash or you have to have some permission slip to travel with more than $10,000 or anything like that. All of that is baloney. You can travel inside the United States with any amount of cash, and it's perfectly legal. Of course, they're going to consider it presumptively, evidence of drug dealing or some other thing, and so they will probably seize it. So you can't rely on the fact that it's just legal to travel with cash. You can refuse a warrantless search. And if you're pulled over or in a situation where you do not have to be searched, then you can refuse that sort of search. Now, a problem, of course, is when you're flying through the airport, you have to be searched in order to go through TSA. And many people think they can be searched after that, and that's generally true. If airport officials have concerns that maybe you were able to sneak something through security, they are able to search you in the secure area of an airport. The problem is DEA officials will sometimes pose as officers who are concerned about, what you might have packed in your bags today and whether it would pose any threat to the airplane, and then use that as a ruse to get you to consent to the search.
We've got to sneak in a quick break here, but our conversation with Dan Albin of the Institute for Justice is just getting started. Stick around. He's got more sound advice right after this.
Are you tired of the IRS following you around like a dark cloud? Call 888-557-4020 and get your life back.
Dispatch, I picked up that load of steel, so I'm ready to roll.
Sounds good. Remember, we're getting paid by weight, so make sure to use a CAT scale.
I wouldn't weigh anywhere else.
Forget misaccuracy when you're truck on a CAT scale.
Since you started, what you've loved about trucking is the freedom. Heading out on your favorite route, a good driving song, and thinking about truck insurance. Well, maybe not that last one. That's why we're here. At OOIDA, we have a full range of truck insurance products, expert advice, and great customer service, helping you get the right coverage for your operation. Go to OOIDA.com because your job is to drive. Our job is to help with everything else.
And we're back. When we left you, Dan Albin of the Institute for Justice was giving us some sound advice about what to do if you find yourself in a civil asset forfeiture situation. We continue our conversation now.
DEA officials will sometimes pose as officers who are concerned about, what you might have packed in your bags today and whether it would pose any threat to the airplane, and then use that as a ruse to get you to consent to the search. Regardless of whether you're, in that sort of situation or you're on the side of a road, if an officer is asking you for your consent to search your vehicle, search your bags, search your person, you should always decline. You should never agree to be searched. If they're asking you, that means they don't have probable cause to search you by itself, and so they need your consent to search you. And you have a Fourth Amendment right not to consent to search. So that's the first and best thing you can do, and you may need to do it repeatedly.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about that because there is a feeling out there when an officer asks to search, your vehicle or what have you. Number one, I feel like people feel obligated to do that, but also I feel like a lot of people hear that and think they're going to look guilty, right, if they say no. Mm-hmm. But again, it is well within your constitutional rights to say no in that case.
It absolutely is. And the courts are unanimous in holding that someone who declines a search, that is not an indicia of illegal activity. People are allowed to exercise their constitutional rights without that being used as evidence against them. And so you can decline a search. Now, an officer may badger you about it. An officer may hassle you about it. And they may ask you multiple times. They may tell you, well, that kind of makes you look guilty. But you don't have to listen to any of that. Just keep declining to consent to the search. Now, I have bad news. The bad news is the fact that you're not consenting to the search does not mean that you will not ultimately be searched. They will find a way. They will say, well, your eyes look a little bloodshot, or I thought I smelled something, a little funny in your car. They will come up with many reasons that might generate probable cause. They have a sort of boilerplate template of things they can say that indicate probable cause. And I've seen them say, your client's carotid artery was throbbing, and so we thought he must be unduly nervous, and therefore, we have probable cause to search him because he's so nervous in an encounter with police. Yeah, that's a real thing, and I've heard it repeatedly, actually.
Wow.
So you get that sort of thing. The other thing that will happen is the highway interdiction teams will have a canine unit either with them or very nearby, because there's a relatively recent Supreme Court case, Rodriguez, that says you can't extend the length of a traffic stop any longer than is necessary to actually complete the traffic stop. And so in the Rodriguez case, there was a traffic stop, but the officer was suspicious for some reason and had the guy wait around for quite a while. I can't remember the amount of time, 15 or 20 minutes, I think, for a canine unit to show up. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't just extend a traffic stop and make it a general, investigative detention without probable cause, and you can't make somebody wait around for 20 minutes for the canine to show up and alert. And so as a result of that, many of the highway interdiction teams have a canine with them or very nearby. And so they will try to, while they're processing your paperwork, have a canine unit roll up on the scene, sniff around the outside of the vehicle, and if they want it to, it will probably alert, because canines, despite their, what you see on TV, they are very responsive to human beings, and if they detect that their handler really wants an alert, they often give a false alert because it makes their handler happy. The sad news is, even though you may not consent, you may still be searched. However, the good news on that is, if you end up in a situation where you're hiring an attorney, the attorney can use the fact that you refuse to consent to challenge the search on Fourth Amendment grounds, and that gives them a very good basis to challenge the search. A couple other things you can do. You can remain silent. Some attorneys recommend literally saying nothing to police, like handing them your driver's license and your registration and literally saying nothing. I think that's a recipe for disaster, and I don't recommend it. But I recommend being as minimal as possible. and don't answer any questions that go beyond sort of who are you and where is your driver's license. You don't have to tell them where you're heading today. You don't have to tell them why. They are going to want to ask a bajillion questions about what it is you're up to and go on this big fishing expedition. You don't have to answer those questions. You also don't have to answer, do you know why I pulled you over today? You can just answer a lot of those questions with a question, like, why did you pull me over today? That kind of thing. So you can exercise your Fifth Amendment right to not speak. If you have a large amount of money with you and you have a easily documented source, like you just withdrew it from a bank or you just won it at a casino or some other thing that can easily document the amount of money, keep those receipts in the envelope or whatever it is that you're storing the money in, because although that's not foolproof, and we've certainly had clients who've had money seized with full documentation, it might help a little bit. And it's at least evidence that can be used in your case if the money is actually forfeited. Couple other tips: if your money is seized, do not sign one of those waivers. Do not sign a waiver that says this isn't my property, I'm willing to surrender it or whatever. They are generally not legally binding because they're signed under coercion. But it's still best practice not to sign one, because they will try to use it to say that, oh, you've already given up your rights. You don't have to receive notice or anything like that. And then if your money is seized or other property, demand a receipt. You should get a receipt if your property is seized. Sometimes it's not going to be for the exact amount of money. Some agencies are instructed not to try to count the amount of money right there on the roadside or right there at the airport. And they want to take it to a bank and run it through a cash counter and get it counted before they provide a receipt with the exact amount. So sometimes it'll just say large amount of bulk currency or something like that. And that's as good as it's going to get, like right there on the spot. But if they do that, ask for, follow-up receipt, the one where they actually ran it and counted it. And that's one of the reasons you want the receipt with the money from the ATM withdrawal or from the casino withdrawal or whatever. You want something that documents how much money there is, because sometimes money disappears between the seizure on the side of the road and when it gets counted in the cash machine. And if you don't have a good way of documenting how much money there was originally, that money is pretty much gone forever, because there's no way to contest very well, how much you actually had versus what the officer says was counted by the cash machine.
Right. And we've only got about a minute left. I did just want to ask you one last question here. Hearing you talk, I'm just shaking my head, just trying to fathom how this kind of thing happens, so commonly. In the case of Mr. Johnson, he did get his money back, again, thanks in part to you and your colleagues, or a large part to you and your colleagues. Just real quick, how hard was that process to make sure that he got his money returned to him?
No, it was extremely difficult because he had hired an attorney originally. He lost initially in trial court because the court ruled sort of prematurely that they didn't think the money was his. They thought there was probable cause evidence indicating, it might not be his money. And so they dismissed his case outright and ordered a forfeiture right at the beginning. And so we had to appeal up to the Arizona Court of Appeals, which took a year and a half to get a ruling and to get that ruling published in order to get Jerry his money back. So you can, fight back and win, but it can take a long time. And if you don't have the resources of a public interest law firm that's representing you pro bono, it's often, unfortunately, not a financially viable thing to do. And so that's why we need to really eliminate this practice, or at least severely constrain it, because in so many of these cases, completely innocent people lose their money and they have no real meaningful way to try to get it back.
Yeah, I'm sitting here shaking my head, but also, again, applauding you and your colleagues there for helping Mr. Johnson and fighting the good fight on this one and providing some advice. Hopefully we'll help somebody out there if they find themselves in this situation, and we appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Our thanks to Dan Albin of the Institute for Justice. For more information on what they do, check out ij.org. And that's our show for today. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to like and subscribe. If you want more content, go to landline.media to get updated news, information, and archived editions of our show. Once again, that's landline.media.
I'm a dad.
A son.
A husband.
Wife.
I'm a writer.
Photographer.
I farm. I'm a veteran.
I love old cars, fishing.
My kids.
Chrome. And I am a professional truck driver.
And together, we are OOIDA.
OOIDA was founded by truckers to stand up and speak on behalf of truckers. We've done that by combining the individual voices of our members into a single, powerful voice. Protecting your interests, defending your rights.
Join us!
Make your voice heard. Join OOIDA, the Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association. Call 1-800-444-5791 or visit OOIDA.com.